Welcome to More Than Words, a podcast about treating the whole child brought to you by the Reading and Language Learning Center. I'm your host, Tristan, and today I'm joined by licensed psychologist Dr. Samantha Sweeney to discuss parenting an anxious child. Hi, Dr. Sweeney. How are you?
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. We're excited for you to be here. I think this is going to be a great topic and something a lot of parents are going to find very, very helpful.
Yeah, I believe so. I often tell people who come to me for my practice that even before COVID, anxiety was the number one thing that people would come to my practice for. So it's quite common.
Yeah, I believe it. Well, let's start with an introduction. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Sure. So as you said, I'm a licensed psychologist. I actually had my degree in school psychology.
Oh,
And
wow.
so I began my career working mostly with kids. I have an office. I have a private practice now. I'm not working in the schools anymore, but even though I love that work. But I have a private practice in Washington, D.C. on Barracks Row, which is in the Eastern Market, Capitol Hill area of the city. And then I also have two websites, just to confuse people. My first website, the name of my organization is called Family Psychological Services of Capitol Hill, nice and long.
Nice
And
and long. Love it.
so people are very clear about what I do and where I am. My website is www.fpsch.com. So it stands for the organization's name. And then the other website I have is something called culturallycompetentkids.com. It is kind of a passion project of mine. I actually have a book coming out in May on that topic for
Wow.
anyone who might be interested. Not what we're going to be talking about today, but just
Right.
another piece of the work that I do. So that's where people can find me.
Perfect. That's amazing. Such a fun project. I didn't realize you had a book coming out in May. So we'll definitely, if you have spots where you want to like direct people to, we can definitely link that in the show notes. And I'll put your website down there too, so people can find you.
Sounds great.
Yeah, awesome. Well, let's hop right into this. I'm not surprised, but it is interesting to hear that anxiety was like the main thing people were coming to you before COVID and after COVID. But like you said, feels very common. So what are the like signs and symptoms of anxiety in children? Like, what do you start to notice? And does it differ by the age, like younger kids to maybe high schoolers?
That's such a good question. So first of all, I think I want to start by kind of normalizing anxiety before I kind of go into like, because anxiety itself is normal. It's
Right.
adaptive. It has lasted for millennia, right? We have anxiety for a reason. All of us are anxious. I actually was talking to somebody about this recently. I'd actually be more concerned if someone had no anxiety ever. Because
Yeah.
anxiety helps to drive us to get things done, to prepare for things, you know?
Right.
And so it has an adaptive function. When we're talking about anxiety in children,
Mhm.
low levels of anxiety are just fine, right? And
Right.
they help to drive children to get things done. And, you know, it can be uncomfortable for us as parents to see our kids experience anxiety, but that's kind of inevitable.
Right.
What I always say in terms of, you know, when anxiety becomes more of an issue or a concern is when it really starts to interfere with your overall life, right? When it starts to
Right.
become something that kind of takes over. But, you know, what we see with anxiety is that, you know, it can look a lot of different ways. You know, you can have kids who have really significant fears that kind of impacts, you know, what they're dealing with.
Right.
But the symptoms themselves, like excessive worry or, you know, racing thoughts or having an increased heartbeat or
Mm.
having your palms sweaty,
Right.
all of those are different symptoms of anxiety. The thing that's tricky with anxiety, especially in kids, because they often don't communicate as well or as much, you know, they don't
Mm.
have the language
Right.
or they, you know, they're just not as good at expressing themselves as
Right.
adults are, is they can't always say like, oh, the thoughts are racing through my head or my
Right.
heart is beating really fast. A lot of what anxiety is can be invisible. And so with kiddos, you might see them acting out in other ways
Oh, okay.
when they're anxious because it's hard for them to articulate what's going on. So, but kids, you know, have different fears that, you know, and those can vary by age, but,
Right.
you know, how anxiety manifests for kids, that that's kind of across the spectrum, like across
Oh,
the age range. Um,
yeah.
the way that anxiety manifests for even like little kids to adults can kind of look the same, but the content of it often changes. So, for
Okay.
example, there are common fears by different ages. So like, a 3-year-old might be scared of the potty. They might be scared of monsters. They might be scared of the dark, right? That's a common
Right.
fear for like a baby, the littles.
Yeah.
Um, when you're 13 and older, you're not scared of the potty anymore.
Right.
And you're not necessarily scared of the dark, but you might be scared of like overall safety. Is somebody coming to
Right.
get me? We live in a large, city. There is
Yeah.
crime, there's stuff happens, right? So they might be scared of being home alone, that kind of
Mm.
stuff. So there's a kind of a range of potential fears there, content area. But in terms of what happens in your body, what happens in your mind, that's often true, like across the lifespan.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. And I guess like kind of makes sense when you like sit down and think about it. But like you said before, like one of the earlier things you said that, for a parent, it's kind of hard to like watch your little kiddo like go through that feeling. And I'm glad you kind of explained that because you can then see like the exact same feeling that they're having, even though, like you said, the content may be different.
Yeah.
So it is like something that you can relate to, but it does like kind of stink to be aware that they are feeling that same way. Um,
Mhm.
in terms of what like kind of makes it manifest, can it be triggered? Can anxiety be triggered by something? Is there a way to like identify that trigger if that is the case? Um, what do you know? Tell us everything.
Yeah, yeah. No, I love that question. I was just having conversations with, some people that I know. And I have this conversation personally and professionally, like all the time
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
triggers. So what I'll say about triggers is that yes, anxiety absolutely can be triggered, and
Yeah.
is often triggered. I would argue that most of the time, or at least much of the time, anxiety is triggered. What is tricky about that is that we can't always identify what the trigger
Mm,
is. Um, because our brains just move really, really, really fast, right? Like,
right.
you can be triggered by like a smell, right?
Right.
And that smell can make you think of, that's the perfume that my grandma wears. And my grandma is my mom's mom. And then my mom is friends with this other lady. And that lady is friends with this kid who wasn't very nice to me this one time at this birthday party. And like what I just described in right in a few seconds can happen in like a millisecond. And
Oh my
and if
gosh.
it's triggered by something like a scent, like how are we supposed to identify that, right? That's very
Right.
difficult. But it can often be triggered, but
Wow.
we can't always identify what that trigger is. What I often do with my clients is I love for them to, even if they can't identify the trigger itself, I give them, some of the homework I might give them in therapy is to write down like what your different, like when you experience heightened anxiety,
Okay.
write down a little bit of information about that. So when does it happen? So like what time of day? Um, from a scale of 1 to 10, how big did it feel to you, right? Like
Right.
that's subjective, but still, I think that's
Absolutely right.
useful. Who were you with? Where were you? Were you at school? Were you at home? Were you at an extracurricular activity? Um, and as much as you can, like kind of describe what happened before and what happened after. And so even if you can't pinpoint the exact trigger,
Mhm.
can often see what I notice is that there are often patterns with this kind of
Okay.
and sometimes the trigger too can be kind of internal. I've definitely seen people where they have kept like a journal of sorts like that, or a
Mhm.
record like that, and they have identified that like every day around 3 o'clock, right? Like that like slump that we all
Yes.
experience is when their anxiety is triggered, right? Or a lot of kids, this is really common for kids, you know, kids are so busy nowadays. They're just like, there's like
Yeah.
go, 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 lots of activities, all this
Yes.
stuff. Their days are full. And so when they lie down, when they put their head on the pillow, unless they are completely exhausted and crash out, immediately,
Right. Right.
their minds start to turn on because it's oftentimes, not always, not for all kids, but oftentimes the one time in their day when they're not thinking about anything. They're really
Oof.
not like doing anything at all. Like they're just trying to sleep, but then their brain kind of turns on and they're like, oh, wait, what about that party and that test and that bubble, or that
Yeah.
like extracurricular, whatever. And then they're like, they start to spin. And that's a trigger, right? Even though
Yeah.
nothing has happened per se.
Happened. Right.
It's almost the absence of something happening
Right.
that has triggered that. So that's a very roundabout way to answer your question. That yes, there are very often triggers. They're not
Okay.
always identifiable, but you can get some kind of clues that can be helpful sometimes.
Yeah. And would you say it's like important to find that trigger, or is it more important to just like notice the moment?
That's such a good question. I love that question. Is it is helpful to identify
Okay.
triggers. I think it's helpful. It's not always possible, right?
Right.
So I like to kind of plan for both, like if this is
Okay.
a trigger, these are the types of things you can do to avoid that trigger. These are the types of things that you can do to manage that trigger, like,
Right.
being, I love the idea of being proactive as possible, right?
Right.
And to try to avoid those things that we know are triggers. But,
Right.
even if we know the triggers, they're not always avoidable, right? Like
Yeah.
lots of kids, school is a trigger. Like, what are you going to do about that?
Right.
Not go to school. That's not an option. Not an option.
Right.
And so you have to come up with ways to manage it. And
Yeah.
so figuring out different coping skills and ways to kind of keep your anxiety in check and that kind of thing is really, to me, the most important part. Also because I feel like anxiety is one of these mental health disorder that really kind of travels with you. If you're not anxious
Mhm.
about one thing, you're anxious about the next thing. And so you
Right.
really need to find, your triggers, I think, often change over the lifespan,
Yeah.
but your coping skills can go with you, right? So, I
Mm.
mean, and those can grow and change as you get older as well, but like,
Right.
anxiety is never going to just go away.
Right.
But you can learn how to manage it. And I think the coping skills really are the things that help with that the most, as opposed to only identifying triggers.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Mhm.
So when like let's say your child is having a moment where they're, heightened anxiety, what can the parent do in that situation to kind of help their child? Is there something they can do?
Mhm. Oh, there's so much you can do. And I'll give you some information that's both like proactive and reactive.
Okay.
So a colleague of mine and I, we have a book on anxiety and
Okay.
called Working with Worry. And I'm sure you'll put that in the show notes and all that good stuff.
Absolutely.
You can find it. But that, there's lots of books and information out there about anxiety and how to help manage it with kids. I think, not to toot my own horn a little bit here, but I think the thing that makes my book with my colleague, Melissa Kilbride, we co-wrote it. The thing that makes this book unique is that it really targets the parent just as
Mhm.
much as the child. And the
Oh,
reason
wow.
the reason for, well, maybe not just as much, but a lot as
Yeah.
well. And the
Yeah.
reason for this is because it is just so easy for us as parents to transfer kind of our anxieties onto our kid.
Yeah.
Not to say that like we're making our kid anxious or we're forcing our anxieties on our kids, but when we
Right.
have our own anxieties, like our own triggers happen, or like, we're experiencing our own stuff, it's hard not to transfer that to our child. So let me give an example, like
Right.
even from my own life. I am a super extrovert, like very, very extroverted. But I was also a super shy kid growing
Okay.
up and very unsure of myself and wondering where my place was in this world and, all this stuff. And I really wanted to connect with people, but like had a hard time with it. So I had to figure a lot of that stuff out as I grew up
Right.
and have since done a lot better. But like, that took some time when I was younger.
Yeah.
And I have two kids, a 12-year-old and a 14-year-old. And my 14-year-old is incredibly introverted.
Okay.
And my 12-year-old is incredibly extroverted, but their friends are both very important to them. And
Yeah.
so I really want them to have friends and I want them to make sure that they're happy and like, all that social life part of them is important. But I have
Yeah.
to be very careful not to like transfer my own anxieties about whether or not they'll have friends when they're, so for example, my 12-year-old, when she was very little, was also pretty shy. And so like if we would show up to like a birthday party or a play date or something like that, she would sometimes be a little bit clingy, to me, before going and playing. And I had to be very careful to make sure that I didn't like try to push her too much or like, worry in my own head, like, oh my God, she's not gonna have any friends. What's gonna happen? This is gonna be awful,
Right.
in order to allow her to kind of do her thing. So there's a lot that parents can do to be proactive and like really think critically about like their own anxieties. One of the things that we have in our book, and I'm looking at it right now because I will forget things like specific. But we have one of the first, we have a lot of activities in our book, like concrete things that you can do. And one of the first activities in our book is called it's a parent activity. It's a anxiety self-reflection. So it's several pages of a parent just like going through and thinking about what their own anxieties are or what their relationship with anxiety is so that they have a better understanding of how to kind of not transfer their anxieties onto their child. So that's like the proactive part, right?
Right.
The more reactive part is, again, I'm keep plugging my book here, but we talk a lot about something called KIST, parent behaviors and language, and that stands for, it's KYST, and it stands for keep your stuff together. And if you're a little cheeky like me, the S can stand for something else. But it's basically like, okay, like let me think about how I'm feeling in these situations. Let me think about what's happening in these situations, and how do I engage in different things to make sure that I am helping my child and not necessarily like attending to my own anxieties, right? And so one of the things I talk to with parents a lot, this is for parent and child. So when your child is super activated, right? They're very like, they're really anxious. They're like, potentially screaming and crying. They're like absolutely whatever. It is really, really important not to do a whole lot of problem solving until they are calm. And the reason for this is because, I'm going to talk a little bit of brain science here. When kids are really activated, when anybody is really activated, actually, not just kids, the thinking, logical, rational, reasonable part of their brain called the frontal lobe, that part of your brain shuts down. It just completely shuts down. And for kids, that we call that the new brain because it takes the longest to develop. So not only does that part of your brain shut down, and this is kind of the fight or flight mechanism that some people might be familiar with. It's like connected to that. Not only does that part of your brain shut down, for kids, it's wildly underdeveloped, right? That part of your brain doesn't fully develop until you're in your mid-20s. This is why teenagers and college students do stupid stuff all the time because they don't have fully developed brains. So it is not helpful for you to be logical in those moments. It is not helpful for you to like try to talk your kid down. It is really important to try to get them to calm down so that they can like shift where their brain is at, where their brain is being activated. So when the brain is super activated, when they're very emotional, they are tapping into their amygdala, which is the emotion center of the brain, right? And so you want them when they are really, when you see your child is very upset, you want to get them out of their amygdala and back into their frontal lobe, which by the way, is underdeveloped. So they need like support. So you need to, so I always say, and we'll talk, I'm sure, more about some options here later, but I think it's super important for kids who have heightened anxiety and parents, frankly, too. Everybody should do this, to have some sort of mindfulness practice, some sort of meditative deep breathing practice, because even though we can't always physically feel it, taking deep breaths does slow your heart rate. Like if you were to watch that on a monitor of some kind, it actually does slow your heart rate, even if you don't feel a whole lot calmer. So it is really important for, I think, kids, parents, whoever, when like you see like people get up here, is to be able to say like, okay, let's just take three deep breaths. Let's just like take a few minutes, and I know for parents, it's like I'm a parent myself, and sometimes we're in a rush. We're trying to get somewhere. School's going to
Yeah.
be like, we're going to be late to school. We're going to be late to appointment. We're going to be late to like whatever. I'm not trying to downplay that. There are times when it's important to be on time, but sometimes it's just like, okay, we're late. Like we're just late.
Yeah.
It is, I think it is more important to make sure that your kid is calm and ready for the day than to make sure that they're like at circle time,
Right.
still like emotionally activated, and these poor teachers like
Right.
trying to calm your kid down. So it's really important for parents to help kids get out of their amygdala into their
Okay.
frontal lobe, and then help them to problem solve, to validate how they're feeling, to kind of reflect back the different things that they might be saying, right? So
Okay.
that the child feels heard, that the child
Right.
feels like you are on their side, and that you're going to work through this together. Not
Right.
so much like you need to get your stuff together before I like, take away the ice cream that we're going to have after school, if you're not in
Mm,
class by 8:30 or whatever. That's not
right.
helpful. That's going to only heighten them. So
Yeah.
kind of keeping your own self calm, like getting in touch with your own relationship with anxiety,
Yeah.
making sure you're not transferring your anxieties onto your child. That's the proactive stuff. But in the moment, getting them out of their amygdala into their frontal lobe, validating their feelings, and problem solving with them.
Okay. Very cool. I'm glad you touched on both of those. Ooh, sorry, both of those things, because I was going to ask you about like, as a parent in that moment, like, what do you do for yourself? Because like, I'm sure, like, I can see even my own self when I have kids being like, my kid is panicked. Like, what am I
Mhm.
like? How do
Yeah.
I calm myself down? But that's great to like think about the fact that, kind of like you said earlier, like the brain is it's happening the same way for the adult brain versus the kid brain, right? Of course, the
Mhm.
frontal lobe piece totally different in terms of the how what's the word I'm looking for, developed it is, right? But in that sense where it's like, okay, everyone just take a deep breath. Like, let's take
Mhm.
the 3 deep breaths. You can do that together. It calms both you and the kid down. Like,
Mhm.
that is just so, it seems so simple, but like once you do it, you realize how effective it is.
It really is wildly effective. And it's so funny. And look, I'm not immune from any of this either. So like I can talk this, but like, I'm a human too. And I can't
Right.
even tell you how many times I've either spoken to people who have said this, experienced it myself, seen it in like real time or whatever, where the kid is upset and the parents like, calm down. Like, you are modeling the exact opposite of what you want your kid to do. And again, I'm not trying to like, like
Right.
the parent feel bad or anything. I get it. I really
Yeah.
do. But it just isn't helpful. It's not effective.
Yeah.
And so if we want our kids to calm down, we got to show them how to calm down,
Right.
especially the littles, especially the littler they are, the more you have to do this.
Yeah.
As the kid gets older, how this manifests like changes, but they still have an underdeveloped frontal lobe as well. So they still
Right.
often need help getting out of their amygdala into their frontal lobe as well.
Yeah. So with this, I appreciate that you normalized anxiety at the beginning of our talk here. So can you touch on what like normal levels of anxiety in children specifically are? Like,
Mhm.
because like you said, we are all anxious, but I'm sure there gets to be a point where you're like, let's talk about this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say I'm careful. I'm careful with the word normal because I don't
Absolutely.
want people to think that if they have an anxiety disorder that they're abnormal, because I think we think abnormal and we think bad.
Right.
And so what I always like to say is like what is being unmanaged and what is manageable. So we
Uh,
want our anxiety to feel manageable, right?
right.
Whatever that means to you. And I think, a general rule of thumb for when anxiety is unmanageable is if it impacts your daily life. And by
Okay.
I mean your daily life as the parent and your child's daily life as the child. So if your child is, having a really hard time, like doing, engaging in in like any social situations, right? Like they
Okay.
just can, like, not that they're nervous, right? Not that they're just like, ooh, I'm nervous about this new birthday party and like how it's going to go. And then they
Right.
arrive at the birthday party and they go and they have a great time and they come back and they're able to tell you they have a great time. Um,
Right.
that's fine, like it's like reasonable. It's a reasonable amount of worry and anxiety around doing something new or having new people
Yeah.
around or something like that. It's that kid who has like maybe a play date at a new kid's house and is like really, really emotionally activated beforehand,
Mm.
and is really having a hard time, just like hysterically crying, like doesn't know how how it's going to go. They go to the play date. The play date's fine. Everything is fine. And they're still upset afterwards. Because like
Mm.
one tiny little thing happened, or they're thinking
Right.
about that one, time when they whatever, and they're just like, well, what if they don't like me? And there's no indication that that is the case.
Right.
So when you are seeing things being impacted on like a daily or weekly or whatever basis, that's an important rule of thumb. Or if their responses or reactions are just wildly out of sync with like kind of reality,
What
right?
happened?
Like
Yeah.
what's really there. I mean, and I'm a little hesitant to even say that because, what we as adults think is like
Yeah.
unreasonable is not the same as what kids think is unreasonable because
Right.
again, we have more developed brains, and we've had more experiences in life and all that kind of stuff. And so we have to be
Right.
careful not to put that on the kid. But but generally speaking, if your kid is just responding in a way that is just so like different from, what you've seen with other kids that age, or, you talk to a pediatrician and they're like, whoa, that seems like a little bit much, or consult with a therapist and they also say the same thing, then that's an important thing to listen to. And also just listen to your gut. Absolutely
Right.
listen to your gut and what if you're like, this isn't normal,
Yeah.
or, whatever your gut is telling you, go call somebody. Like,
Yeah.
you can talk to somebody about that. You don't have to like wonder on your own. There
Right.
are resources available for you to talk to people. So don't feel like you have to kind of suffer in silence. Ask somebody about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And and again in my book, one of the things that I think was really helpful is that we put in examples at different ages of
Oh, yeah.
what is like, okay, we want to like keep an eye on this, like, let's see if this gets worse, like whatever. And then we have, like the kind of the progression of like, something that's not a concern, let's keep an eye on it. And like, no, you should call a professional right now.
Okay.
So I think that that's like a helpful tool for people
Yeah.
to kind of have a better sense of like, okay, like maybe like you think that you're containing it and everything's fine. And then you're like, you see that like that example is you're like, oh, that's really similar to what we go through. I guess we should call somebody. So, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that the book, because that was, the next thing I was going to ask you was essentially like, how do you know when you need to start looking into getting more support for your kid? Like you said, kind of like interrupting daily life, or, weekly life, having things be a little out of sync with what it you're seeing happen.
Mhm.
So once you've like realized all those things are kind of going on, like what are the avenues for support? You mentioned therapists.
Mhm.
What do you recommend?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There are so many different ways to look into this. I mean, Google is your friend here, obviously.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, you can definitely call your pediatrician. They can always
Okay.
give recommendations. That's a great way to start. Another good way to start is your child's school. So the
Oh,
school counselor, the school social worker, or the school psychologist, we
okay.
can give you, and whatever you have in your school. Most schools have, well, I don't want to say most, many schools have all three.
Hmm.
Um, Counselors and psychologists are required. A lot of people say to me like, "Oh, my kid's school doesn't have a school psychologist." I'm like, if they're in public school, they do. It is
Yeah.
required by law. They might have like three or four other schools and be there very
Right.
infrequently, but they have a school psychologist.
Right.
And those people are amazing resources because absolutely have contacts with people in the community. But
Yeah.
so does the school counselor, so does the, speech and language person. Any person who is like in a clinical position is going to have some of those resources. You can
Okay.
certainly ask teachers, you can certainly ask the principal, especially, if you're in a private or charter school and maybe they don't have those positions,
Right.
start with a teacher and a principal, and they will often have resources as well. But
Okay.
I'm biased because I'm a school psychologist, but
Yeah.
I say start with the school psychologist and then
Yeah.
go from there. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. And so you said you're a pediatrician. So like if you had like a general practitioner, same kind of a thing where you could just
Yes.
ask, like what are your recommendations? Okay.
Yes. Yep.
So in terms of asking the school counselor, would you recommend getting services from like I don't know, let's just say we're in a scenario where you don't necessarily have like money for private services. Would you recommend the school counselor to go to them too and see if they can offer services for anxiety, or is that not something that school counselors are generally equipped to handle?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked this
Okay,
question.
great.
Because as a school psychologist, like that was a thing, when I was working in the schools. Okay, sorry. So I apologize a little ahead of time. This may be a more
No, you're
long-winded
fine.
question. So the role of, the school psychologist, counselor, social worker, whomever, is to provide services for a child so that they can access the curriculum. They are
Okay,
not treating the disorder. Does that make
gotcha.
sense?
Yep.
So, and for most, well, I won't say most, but many schools, those professionals are only providing services to kids who require it by law. So they have
Okay.
something called a 504 plan where they receive like accommodations, right?
Right.
Or they qualify for an IEP, an individualized education plan, where, you know, every year their IEP plan is reviewed, and sometimes that includes counseling services. There
Okay.
are some schools that do have resources to provide some services to kiddos who are not don't require, don't have that those different services. Um,
Right.
but man, these people are stretched thin, trust me.
Yeah.
They are busy, and if anyone wants to, advocate on behalf of
Yeah.
social services in the schools, that would be great, because there needs to be more funding. Just saying.
Yeah.
Um, but there's just really usually not very many resources in terms of accessing that kind of.
Okay.
Yeah. So in most communities, and certainly here in Washington, D.C., there are options for lower cost or no cost services.
Okay.
They are not easy to access. They are not easy to find.
Right.
I have to admit, I do not have a lot of resources around that.
Yeah.
But if your school has a social worker, they probably will. If your
Okay.
school does not have a social worker, the counselor is probably the next best person. The school psychologist or the counselor, one of those people will probably have
Okay.
some resources, but there are always community resources to help
Yeah.
people access, lower cost therapeutic services. They're just often, there's often wait lists or that kind of.
Yeah.
But the people in the schools are not supposed to treat the disorder. That is not
Okay.
their role. Yeah.
Okay. That's good to know because I don't know that I would have realized that.
Yeah.
Um, because
Yes.
I
It's
think,
slightly different.
right, when you hear counselor, you're like, that's the same, that's synonymous with therapist. It's all the same
Yeah.
thing,
Yeah.
right? And you're there for that. So that's a good distinction to make.
To be fair, you're often in practice doing very similar work.
Oh, I'm
Like,
sure.
having worked in the schools and then worked in private practice, I'm like, well, it's pretty similar.
Yeah.
Um, but the goal is different. It's
Yeah.
technically different. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
So switching gears from school to home, now that, we've got our kiddos some services, they're seeing a therapist, all of that. What can a parent do? How can they at home build a safe space for their kid to be able to work on their anxiety and work through it?
Such a good question. Um, some parents might not like my answer. You don't build a safe space.
Oh,
First of all, you work well, and I'm going to qualify that a little. I know that's a little
Of course.
provocative, but I'm going to qualify that a little bit. But first of all, you work with your therapist. If your kid has a therapist, the parent should be working with that therapist too. At least
Yeah.
communicate, whether just if it's just general communication or updates or checking in, it can be pretty casual, but it can
Right.
also be more specific, like depending on how young your kid is, how significant the anxiety is, where the anxiety manifests. Oftentimes it's best practice for the parent to be kind of involved in the treatment process. And
Yeah.
so, having your kid, I often have kiddos who do things and I give them homework and then I, email the parent and say, like, this is what we did today. This is what they're doing to work on this. This is how you can support it at home.
Yeah, very cool.
But I also have sometimes have the kid be the one to communicate that to the parent or ask the kid if they're okay with me communicating to the parent, especially depending on age, right? Like
the age,
teenagers are totally different. Some of them don't want their parents involved at all,
right?
Even if they should be, and some do. And so there's a range there, but yes, best practice for parents to be involved in treatment. And then in terms of me saying that provocative thing about not creating a safe space, anxiety manifests because it's like worry about the future, right? Oftentimes worry about what could happen, the coulda, woulda, shouldas, or what you did and like what would happen if I didn't do this or something like that. And what I find is that it can keep a kid kind of paralyzed, right? Like keep them from engaging in certain things. It can keep them from taking risks and doing new things and trying new things. And you as a parent, I can see how a lot of the time parents might say, oh, well, I don't want to push him too much, or I don't want him to try too much and be really upset and, fail and stuff like that. Part of your role as a parent is to encourage your child to not do things that are safe, to take risks, to try new things, and to be a soft landing space for when they fall, right? For when they don't do well, or when like life, is hard. And you don't want to push your kid too hard, too much, right? There is a range here, right? Like if you have a super shy kid, don't like make them try out for like the lead role in the musical at school. Like that's, like let's
it's a bit much.
Let's be reasonable here. But maybe, set up a play date with one other kid in their home where they feel comfortable, right? And so this is really hard for me as a parent to say, and it's really hard for parents to hear, but we cannot protect our kids from the inevitable hard times in life, right? And if we create too much of a safe space in our own household, they're going to think that's what life is. And so we want to, within reason, right? Knowing your own kid, you're as a parent, you know your kid, right? You want to create opportunities for them to take risks and fail and take risks and be successful. But you don't want to only do the latter. You do not want to set kids up to think that when they take risks, they're almost always going to succeed. You want them to be able to fail too. And so when they do fail, again, goes back to like you as a parent, like keeping your stuff together and engaging in those KISS behaviors. You want to make sure that you're not as devastated by their failure, or not failure is the wrong word, but difficulty or, hardship, that you are able to keep your own stuff together, and that also that you can, congratulate them for trying and tell them how proud you are of them for working hard, and tell them that it's amazing that even though it didn't go the way they wanted, they took a risk, and that is amazing. And so, and then ice cream, like my personal philosophy is ice cream makes everything better. Just facts. I don't care how cold it is outside, get ice cream. So facts. So that's kind of how I feel about that. So I don't want parents to create a safe space, such a safe space that kids do not take risks. Let your child fail, let your child have hardships. and then provide them with ice cream when things go wrong.
When things go wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. I like that you just came at it with don't. I liked your provocative
Yeah.
answer because it I think like you said, it's hard for parents to hear. And so it's kind of like good to have a little bit of shock.
Right. I mean, it's hard for me
And
to say. I'm like,
yeah, I'm sure.
so devastating to watch your child like struggle or
Yeah.
cry or like
Ugh,
feel bad about what happened. And but
right.
like to think that if you I mean, think about your own experiences. Think about when you left home. Think about when like you
Mhm.
went off and did things. Could you imagine if you like I mean, I grew up in like the 80s and 90s. Like we were allowed to fail, trust me. So like I could not imagine going off to college, right? Like I did, and like not having had failures, like things that I was like, well,
Right.
that didn't go well. Like to have that for the first time when you're 18 and you're out of the
Yeah.
house and you don't have your parent,
Right.
to give you a hug at the end of the day and say everything's going to be okay. Like I'm proud of you
Right.
anyway. I don't think that that's
Oof.
positive because your child, like if you cocoon your child enough that they don't have those experiences before they turn 18 and leave the nest,
Right.
they're going to have them when they are 18 or older. And that sounds awful. That sounds really
Yeah.
awful to experience that for the first time when you're that age.
Right.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, yeah. When
No.
people expect you to handle it like an
Yeah,
adult, even though you may be, your frontal
yeah.
lobe maybe isn't fully mature.
Yeah, when you're sharing a room in a college dorm and you
No.
can't close the door and cry with your stuffed
Right.
animal by yourself, like no, thank you.
Yeah.
Like,
No, thank you.
no, thank you. No.
No.
Yeah, I want to cry by myself. Thank you.
Yes, thank
Yeah.
you very much.
Anyway.
Well, my last question for you then is what strategies can a parent teach their child to help them work through their anxiety or maybe those failures you're talking about or anything of that nature, like on their own, so that when they do leave home, they have those skills and they don't have to, feel like they need to rely on their parent.
Yeah, yeah. And again, I'm going to plug it, but my book has a ton of these different things, and I'll just highlight a few.
Yeah.
First of all, I just want to say that the in our book we have like so many different interventions for kids. I think it's really important not to try all of them. Like if
Right.
you get the book and you say like, oh my gosh, there's so many. The goal is not to have a lot, like to have a ton of options. The goal is to have options that work.
Right.
And for me, I think it's really important for most kids to have different options that are like that kind of target different things. So
Okay.
there are 4 different areas of intervention that we have for activities and strategies that we have in the book. They're called
Mhm.
cognitive restructuring, which is kind of thinking differently about your own thoughts.
Okay.
Mindfulness, like I said, I think everyone should have a mindfulness practice, like deep
Right.
breathing, like physical, like kind of regulation in that way.
Mhm.
Self-regulation, so especially people who have very physical symptoms
Mm.
of anxiety, people who like hyperventilate, like
Right.
that kind of deep, like breathing where they can't like whatever, or they physically shake or they get stomach aches or headaches. All those
Mhm.
are different symptoms of anxiety. Self-regulation can be very effective with helping with that. And then creativity. So using
Mm.
using if you have a creative kid or you are a creative person yourself, which I am not. But lots of people are, so I think using it can be really helpful. So I'll just highlight a few of these uh, different things so that people
Yeah.
have a sense of like what they can actually use. So with cognitive restructuring, one of my favorite ones is something called 4 quick questions.
Mm.
And this is more for maybe grade school to older tween teen kids.
Okay.
And basically, I love it because it's so quick and easy. You can do it without anybody seeing. Oh, that's another thing. I think it is super important, super, super important for kids to have at least one, maybe 2 effective coping skills that they can do without anybody being able to tell what they're doing. And I
Yeah.
personally think mindfulness is the best one for that.
Yeah.
because like everybody breathes. So like,
Right.
no one can tell that you're like tensing your muscles and then releasing them. Nobody can tell that you're like just taking deeper breaths than you usually do.
Right.
I mean, not really, like, or they don't care,
Right.
so I think it's really important. So if you're sitting there about to take a test and you're like kind of hyperventilating, right, you need
Hmm.
something immediately, like some teachers are going to be like, no, you can't go up to go to the bathroom. We're taking a test. Like you need
Right.
something that you can do in your chair immediately that's not going to disrupt the classroom, that no one else can tell is happening. And so I think
Right.
that's really, really important. So this is one example of that, even
Okay.
though it's not mindfulness. So you ask yourself 4 questions. So they are, is a thought that I'm having, so you're kind of analyzing your thoughts. Is the thought that I'm having causing my anxiety to feel better or worse? So like,
Hmm.
am I spinning? Am I spinning myself, right? Like, am
Right.
I making the, is this helpful? Um,
Right.
where did I learn this thought? Or can I remember the first time I had this thought? So kind of
Hmm.
analyzing. Is this thought logical or reasonable, or is this something that could ever happen or ever really, it has ever happened or ever could happen?
Okay.
And then the fourth one is this thought true?
Mm.
Or is there any evidence for this, or is there just a feeling that I have? Another
Right.
thing that I often have kids do that I think can help, that's kind of takes the place of like the third or fourth question, is like, what would your friend tell you if they heard
Mm.
this thought in your head? Like, girl, you crazy.
Right.
Like you get A's on all of your exams. Why are you freaking out about this one? Like, or
Right.
like you're an amazing softball player. Like, why are you like hyperventilating before you get up to like hit? Like,
Yeah.
so I like that one as well. So I like to do that with kids. That's something that they can do like on their own by themselves, like no problem.
Yeah.
A mindfulness example that I have is called sensory awareness. So basically what you're doing is
Mm.
you're just going through all of your different senses. So seeing, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. And like taste, even though we're not necessarily eating anything, there is like a taste in your mouth.
Right.
And so like you just take a pause and just say like, what do I see right now? What can I feel right now? Like, whether it's feeling on my back or like, I'm touching my desk or touching the chair or
Right.
whatever. What can I hear? Like, can I hear the birds outside? Can I, hear people scratching on their papers, what do I smell? So like just getting in touch, if you find that your anxiety has you kind of like, because anxiety is often future oriented. So if you are just
Right.
spinning, 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 oh my goodness, this is happening. What if this happens? And what if this happens? And what this happens?
Yeah.
And a lot of people do that with their anxiety. So if
Yeah.
you find yourself doing that, bring it back to the here and now and just being like, okay, this is what's happening right now. This is what I'm experiencing right now. This is what I see going on around me right now.
Yeah.
Can be a really effective tool. This is I'm giving you like all these examples that you can do, like just, for yourself, which it actually is so great. Is I do a lot of that in therapy.
Yeah.
It's just having a cold drink of water.
Mm.
It doesn't have to be cold. It can be, but it is very hard to, if you have like shallow breathing or like kind of hyperventilating, it
Right.
is very hard to hyperventilate and drink a cup of water at the same time.
Yeah.
And what I find is, even though it doesn't have to be cold, it helps because the coldness kind of shocks your system in a way that like
Mm.
warm water doesn't. Like if you're sipping hot tea or something like that. But the cold water is like, ooh, okay. Like it kind of
Right.
like jolts you out of yourself a little bit, which
Yeah.
can be really helpful. Um, and then the last one that I really like is a creativity one, and that is to draw your anxiety. So to draw what it looks like, what it feels like, is it a monster? Is it, and this is any age at all.
Right.
Whatever feeling you have, just draw it. And, again, I am not very creative, but this is really something that especially little ones and creative kids can really tap into to kind of understand what's going on in their brain and in their heart, is to draw how it feels. And it can be
Right.
wildly helpful for the adults in their life to see what they are experiencing, because
Right.
some kids just really cannot articulate things. It's almost like a form of journaling, but
Yeah.
doing it in a, which I also highly recommend, but doing it in a creative way. So,
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are just a few quick
Yeah.
examples that we have in the book, and there are just so many others. So if these ones don't work, I hear that a lot from different people. They're like, "Oh, I tried this and it didn't work." I'm like, first of all, did you try it more than once?
Right.
Or did you expect it to just get rid of all of your anxiety? Because like that's not what's going to
Not
happen.
real.
Sorry. Um, but you have to try at it and try at it at
Right.
least a few times, at least over the course of like a week or two. And then if it's really not working, try something else,
Yeah.
don't feel like you have to stick with any one thing. So, but don't dismiss it either. So,
Right.
you gotta work through that. So
Yeah.
those are some options for people,
Yeah.
who want, things that they can do in the moment right now that could be helpful.
Yeah, I think those are fantastic. All of them sound so like grounding, especially like, like just taking a moment and like seeing like what's in the root, the touch, taste, smell, all of that. The senses, I think is, like a really good one. But I also appreciate you saying you have to try them like more than one time. Because I
Yep.
do think that, especially if you're in that heightened state, you feel like, oh, well, like someone told me this is going to work, so it has to work. And like you just think immediately it's going to make all the magic. It's magical. It's just going to make everything go away. So I appreciate you saying, you got to try it a couple times, and that one might not work for you, but another one could.
Mhm.
So yeah, because I think everyone gets, like there are like a handful of things that get passed around, like people just talking. And
Yeah.
if you only try those handful of things, it's like those things may not work for you, and that's fine.
That's exactly right. And I know that, here in DC, I don't know if it's different here in DC versus somewhere else, but like, I find that kids, especially teenage kids, are very open about like being in therapy and like,
Yeah.
being anxious and thank goodness people are starting to
Yes.
be like that stigma is reducing. And so you might even have a kid whose friends are like, this is how you deal with anxiety. And,
Yeah.
I think that's so amazing that these kids are sharing that kind of stuff, but it might not
Yeah.
work for you, and that's okay.
Right.
So just keep that in mind that these techniques are really individual, just like anxiety itself
Yeah.
is really individual.
Oh, this has been amazing. I think it's going to be so helpful to everyone that listens to it because, like you said, even if you don't have anxiety as labeled as something that you're really struggling with mentally, like everyone has a bit of anxiety in them. And to be able to have some tools to work through that after, like listening to this and checking out your book, that is so helpful. So I really appreciate you being here today.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a lovely conversation. Really appreciate you
Yeah.
having me.
Absolutely. Well, I'll leave all of your stuff in the show notes so folks can find you and your book and all of the things. And I think we'll wrap up here. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to the audience for listening. Make sure to subscribe and leave us a little rating and review. It helps other folks find the podcast, and we'll chat with you next time.